finish up what we didn't have time for last Monday. Do you see molecular genetics on your screen?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, so I'm not going to go over most of this again, just to refresh your minds. We talked about technologies that are molecular in nature and are very common in both the lab and in general. You run into these technologies all the time. And today I want to talk about the use of some of them for the genetic modification of organisms. So what I'd like you to remember is the distinction between the endonucleases and all other forms of depolymerases, enzymes that digest various different kinds of polymers. They're all non-specific, whereas nucleases can be very specific and therefore very useful. So remember that. Remember what plasmids are and how plasmids are used in genetic engineering and in cloning. And then remember how PCR is done and how powerful it is and why it's so useful throughout biology. And I went over CRISPR briefly last time, so I won't do it again this time. And I want to start here. So you should all be seeing a can of corn. And I want you to look at the label on this can of corn and tell me what you see.
Non-GMO.
Non-GMO. Okay, what does that suggest to you?
That it doesn't have genetic modification.
Right, it means that it doesn't, or at least it's advertised to not have genetically modified corn in it. But what does that imply? That they're advertising non-GMO as though that's a good thing.
Yeah, they're like more healthy.
That's the implication. But what does it say about GMOs?
They're not necessary for like consumption. They've done it in the past, but they're learning they don't have to do it. It's not necessary.
Yeah, you're on the right track. If you say non-GMO is good, then that implies that GMO is not good. And so I'd like to explore that today. And I don't know what opinions you might have right now about GMOs, but I'd like to tell you a way of, or expose you to a way of thinking about GMOs that's not conventional. Okay, first of all, genetically modified organisms, what are they? Well, there are two technologies available for creating a GMO. One you're already very familiar with. You join an egg and a sperm. Now, this is traditional breeding. It's been practiced by humans for over 13,000 years. And the result of it is that all domesticated plants and animals are GMOs. That is, they've been genetically modified from their natural state. So you can take any domesticated plant or animal, and that would be an example. I've chosen the example of dogs. all dogs are wolves. They all have a wolf genome. So here you see a wolf. Here you see dogs. You can see they're highly pleomorphic. They range in size from very large to very small and have a lot of other characteristics that are unique to breeds, and none of them looks like a wolf. The reason that dogs look the way we see them today is because they're genetically modified. Humans have selected from litters of puppies after litters of puppies to get the characteristics that they want. So how can we explain these differences in phenotypes if they all have the same genome? They all have the same set of genes. We've talked about this phenomenon from time to time during the course. Well, it's gene regulation. So as you may recall, at any point in time, most genes in an organism are off, and only a few are actually producing products. And so by differentially regulating the genes in a wolf genome, you can get each one of these dog phenotypes. But my point is that this is genetic modification. Now, there's another way to do it. Using the technologies that we discussed last time on Monday, you can clone DNA and manipulate it. This technology has only been available since the 1970s, since the discovery of restriction enzymes and plasmids and PCR. And so now we have two ways that we can create GMOs, egg and sperm, or DNA manipulation in test tubes. I've highlighted in pink here the point that I want to emphasize. The difference between traditional GMOs, the egg and sperm type, and the contemporary ones, DNA manipulation, is not the types of products you get, but rather the difference is the technology. So we've got two different technologies. Either of them can lead to a genetically modified organism. Well, the next point, genetic engineering is precision breeding, whereas traditional breeding is imprecise and produces many unknowns. So that's illustrated here in the lower left. Traditional plant breeding, we have two plants, one with yellow genes and one with green. And the yellow one has a gene of interest. So we'd like to transfer that gene into the commercial variety here, which has green genes. So you do a cross. And as you know, when you do a hybrid cross, in the progeny, the F1, the half of the genes are from one parent and half are from the other. So we have half yellow genes and half green ones. And we have the gene of interest here. But what we wanted to do was transfer the gene of interest. What we actually did was transfer not only that gene, but half of the other genes from the yellow parent too. So the only one that we know about is the one that we selected for. We don't know what's happened in the rest of the genome. So this is highly imprecise, but it's the way egg and sperm breeding have been done for thousands of years. Now, with plant biotechnology, we have the same issue. We want to transfer this gene from the yellow plant to a commercial variety, which is green. So how do we do it? We cut out this gene, clone it, transfer it specifically into the green genome so that now we have an entirely green genome with just one gene added. We know what that gene is, we know what it produces, and so we have a precise product that we can predict how it should act and then test to see if it acts that way. So this is a very important distinction I want you to have in your minds. What happens when you do traditional plant breeding and what happens if you do biotechnology. Now, in the case of traditional plant breeding, you do the first cross and you have a 50-50 set of genes. Now, as you know, you can start back crossing this to one of the parents. In this case, you want to back cross it to the green parent so that after several generations, you'd have largely a green genome, but you'd still have a lot of the genome that you knew nothing about. You'd only be able to guess. The other point I want to make here is that people worry about using genetic engineering might create something toxic, for example, or something unwanted. And that's true, but you can do the same thing with egg and sperm breeding. And I have an example of that here with potatoes. All potatoes contain toxins called glycoalkaloids. Here's the structure of one. It's a small molecule called solanine. And potatoes accumulate glycoalkaloids primarily to deter pests, but they're also associated with disease resistance. Alkaloid production is controlled, it's polygenic, it's controlled by many genes. So if you do a cross, you get a bell-shaped curve like this. And then if you test them, in the case of this experiment, what the investigators wanted was disease resistance. So they scored all their clones for disease resistance. And the black bars are showing the ones that are disease resistant. It turned out that highly associated with that was alkaloid concentration. And alkaloids are poisons, they're toxic. In fact, if you go to a grocery store and buy a potato, it will have alkaloids in it, but at such low concentrations, they don't hurt you. But in this case, breeding resulted in high concentrations of alkaloids. These potatoes could never be commercialized because they were too poisonous to eat. And as I said, this was done by traditional plant breeding techniques. So either type of technology can result in a product you want or one you don't want.
I've got a question, Professor.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to use genetic modification, couldn't you use that to add more nutrients or something to
Yes.
something?
Yeah.
That,
That's one of the,
corn, for instance, it's got a high concentration of sugar. That's something that diabetics try to avoid. Could you alter that corn to where it had less sugar so it could be taking up less fat, less carbohydrates?
yeah, that's certainly true. And you do that by identifying the enzymes involved in the biosynthesis of the particular sugar you had in mind. And then you'd either delete or manipulate one or more of the genes in that pathway. And I'll get to an example of that a little bit later. I'll talk about coffee and how we might have genetically decaffeinated coffee. So it's a very straightforward process. Okay, what is the official definition of a GMO? It's here in yellow. Any organism whose genetic material has been altered using genetic engineering techniques, that is, using molecular biology, restriction enzymes, plasmids, and so on. It does not occur naturally by mating and or natural recombination. It does not occur by these. This is sperm and egg. So in pink, I've drawn your attention to this definition is based entirely on technology. It's not based on the product that is produced by the technology. Any organism that's been, whose genetic material has been manipulated with plasmids and restriction enzymes is called a GMO. Those that have been mated with sperm and egg are not called GMO by definition. Okay, let's look on the left. How would we actually make a GMO out of a plant? Well, first you'd have to have a trait that you were interested in, like larger seeds or shorter growing season, some trait for which you could clone a gene. So you'd isolate that gene, clone it, and put it into a plasmid. And you remember from last time, we talked in detail about how you do this, and it might be worth going back to that. Here. So this is how you clone. Let me go back one more to here. So in the example we're going to use, we're using the restriction enzyme EcoR1, and its recognition site is GAATTC. It's a palindrome, so it reads backwards, GAATTC. So when you cut it, it has an overhang of TTAA on one strand and AATT on the other strand. So now we're going to clone. So we have a plasmid here, a circle of DNA, and we cut this with EcoR1. And what that does is leave a cut with a staggered ends. So on one side, the extending piece is TTAA. On the other side, it's AATT. Now we're talking about cloning a gene from a plant now. So we have here plant DNA, and we cut it with the same enzyme, EcoR1. So what does that do? It chops the DNA up into little pieces, but they have what are called sticky ends. They have ends that correspond to the ends of the plasmid, TTAA and AATT, so that they will anneal. Hydrogen bonding between the A's and the T's and the T's and the A's gives you a recombinant plasmid. Now you've got pieces, or if you already have the gene cloned, you have the gene of interest in a plasmid, which is easily manipulated. And then DNA ligase seals the gaps, and you have a chimeric plasmid. So this is the technology that you would use to genetically engineer a plant.
Professor,
Yeah.
I have a question. I know it's like tiny little amounts and everything that's changing, but does that even minutely change like the actual size of what's going on here, since it's adding stuff into there? Like, does it get bigger?
Is this changing the size? Yeah. So the plasmid is a certain size. It might be, say, 5 kilobases. The pieces that you clone in can vary in size. And so all the chimeric plasmids that you end up with have increased in size by the amount of DNA that was cloned in. So if you have a 5 kb plasmid and you have a 2 kb fragment of foreign DNA, you'd now have a 7 kb plasmid.
Okay, thank you. And then how do you, is that chimera? Chimera? Is that the actual scientific term for that?
Yeah, it's commonly used, a chimeric
Okay.
plasmid.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're back here. I've just told you now how you make a chimeric plasmid, a plasmid with a piece of foreign DNA in it. And in this case, the foreign DNA is a gene from a plant that you'd like to transfer to another plant. There are various ways to get this chimeric plasmid into a plant, a gene gun or through some kind of a plasmid vector. But at any rate, once you do that, you now have a genetically engineered plant called a GMO, and you can grow it up and test it however you like. Now, testing is required for plants constructed with these techniques, tested for efficacy and safety. And before they can be grown commercially, they have to be approved by 3 different governmental agencies. The EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, tests them to see if they are any danger to the environment. The FDA, Food and Drug Administration, tests them for toxicity to humans and animals. And the USDA checks to see that all the rules have been followed. So this is a hedge against mistakes. Significantly, these approvals are not required for non-GMOs. In other words, if you make your genetic modification by doing crosses, sperm and egg, you don't have to go to the government at all. You can just grow it commercially or do anything you want to it. In other words, non-GMOs are not regulated. Now, what crops in the United States are genetically modified by molecular techniques? The main ones are corn, soybean, and cotton. And you can see that they far outpace any others. And if you look at this graph, you can see that over the course of time, now with these 3 crops, over 90% of each of these 3 crops is GMO, genetically modified with 1 or more genes. And the thing that distinguishes them is that the modification was made with molecular techniques. Why do so many farmers choose GMO crops? Obviously, they're very popular among farmers. Well, you can manage weeds and control insects. Those are the main reasons. Prevent crop diseases, increase productivity. I'd like to show you pictures of a couple examples of GMO crops in the field. On the left is herbicide-resistant soybeans treated with a non-specific herbicide called Roundup. You may have seen Roundup in the news a lot. Well, what Roundup is non-specific. It will kill any plant. So these soybeans have been genetically engineered with a gene, a single gene that makes them resistant to Roundup. So if you spray this whole field, the only thing that will grow is soybeans. And these weeds here, when the field was sprayed, happened to have been missed. So they were able to grow simply because they were not treated with the herbicide. So that's one example. Very beneficial to farmers because they can control weeds with one spray of a chemical. Mechanical weeding is not necessary. On the right, you can see an example of insect resistance, again mediated by a single gene. So this is cotton. And the cotton on the right is not genetically engineered. And you can see insects have completely killed the plants. Whereas the cotton on the left contains a single gene for resistance to the insect. It's actually a toxic protein. It's toxic to insects. It's not toxic to anything else. Has no effect on any other form of life, as far as we know, except for certain insects. And this gene is from a bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis, which, as I said, it's insect specific, and it can be used in any plant against insects. This just happens to be cotton. But the thing to be stressed here is that with this single gene for insect resistance, no poison is needed to be sprayed on the field to protect the plants from insects. The plants themselves protect themselves, and they don't need insecticide.
Professor,
Yeah.
I had a question. How does natural adaptations happen? Because I know like in Africa they had yellow watermelon, and that's a natural adaptation, and normally that wouldn't necessarily be something that grows there, kind of like how plants don't always grow in certain climates. So how does something just decide that it's going to naturally adapt to an environment?
Well,
but not their
that
plant?
was probably, I'm just guessing now, but you say it's an orange something.
They're yellow watermelons, and they're actually like honey kind of and sweeter than watermelons we have here in the States.
Uh-huh. And it's different from the other watermelons.
Yeah, it's yellow instead of red, like the inside.
I see, the inside. Okay, that is probably a mutation, a naturally occurring mutation, which is not uncommon. I doubt if that's a genetically engineered plant.
Right. So how does that work where like a plant decides to do that? Because like normally watermelon wouldn't necessarily grow in an environment like that. And so why
Right.
does that plant do it, but like say not orchids?
Well, the plant doesn't decide, it just happens in its genome. You remember when we talked about DNA replication, mistakes can be made in the copying?
Right.
Okay, so I'm speculating now, but I'm guessing that this is a spontaneous mutation. It just occurred as a mistake, and the result of it was to change the color. So it's a mistake in the pathway. That the pink color that watermelons usually have is due to probably lycopene, a pigment, and there was a mutation that blocked the pathway from going to red, and it stopped at yellow.
I was just curious because like the taste is different too. It was just because I was stationed over there and I just never seen it before. And it was just different. So I was just curious how that works.
Well, if this was in Africa, genetically engineered plants are not allowed to be grown in Africa. So I'm almost certain that this is not a GMO. It's probably just a spontaneous mutation, which is not uncommon. When you grow millions and millions of plants, it's not uncommon to find a mutant.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, advantages of genetic engineering versus sperm and eggs. It's faster, can be done in months instead of years or decades, except for the regulatory factors, which slow everything down. And it's gene specific. There are no off-target genes in the product. You know exactly what you've done and how you can make predictions on that. Where are GMOs grown around the world? Well, the green areas are where GMOs can be grown and sold and imported. There are no restrictions on them after they have passed all the governmental regulations. So it includes all of North America, most of South America, Australia, Southeast Asia, and India. But notice the places that they're not allowed. Western Europe, for example, except for Spain, Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, all of Russia do not allow, and significantly Japan, do not allow GMOs to be grown. Now, they can make exceptions about importing in these areas. If they need something bad enough, for example, if Western Europe needs soybeans from the US, almost all soybeans are GMOs, they will import them if they need them for their agricultural needs. So the point is that GMOs are controversial depending on where in the world you are. I want to give you a couple of examples of GMOs. Now, here is a trait that was intended to be of use to consumers, to people who eat rice, in contrast to the traits that are of use to farmers. It's called golden rice. The reason, have any of you heard of golden rice? If you were in Africa, did you ever hear of golden rice?
Yes, I have.
You did?
I've
Okay,
heard of it, but I've like never tried it or seen it.
okay. And the reason you didn't is because it has never been available to you. Golden rice is called that because it's yellow. And the reason it's yellow is that it overproduces vitamin A, contrast to normal rice, which is white. A vitamin A deficiency kills 1.5 million people a year, and it causes blindness in about 500,000 children in over 120 countries. Rice provides the bulk of the energy intake for many people in Asian countries in particular. So recognizing this, in the year 2000, these two scientists, Ingo Petrikas and Peter Beyer, in Europe, decided to make rice, genetically engineer rice, to overproduce vitamin A. And their idea was that now people in developing countries who have a deficiency in vitamin A can resolve that deficiency simply by eating rice as they normally would. So 1 cup a day satisfies the vitamin requirement for vitamin A. The agribusiness companies that have the technology to do this now have offered free distribution to subsistence level farmers. No company receives royalties, but it's not grown in any country. And the primary reason is an organization known as Greenpeace. There are others that also oppose golden rice, but Greenpeace has been the main one, opposes the use of any GMOs in agriculture, and specifically the cultivation of golden rice, claiming it will open the door to more widespread use of GMOs, again, on the assumption that there is something inherently bad with this technology. So why is it so slow to get things developed? Primarily because of the regulatory hurdles. So let me tell you just briefly how this genetic engineering was done. Rice has a pathway for making vitamin A, but it's a very slow pathway. It makes very little vitamin A. So what these two scientists did was substitute two genes in rice, one from a daffodil, a plant, and the other from a bacterium, such that this pathway went very much faster and produced a lot of vitamin A, and that's why the rice is yellow. Now, the significant thing here, in addition to the genes themselves, is that they put them under the control of promoters that are on only in the endosperm. The endosperm is part of the seed. So vitamin A is overproduced only in the seeds. In all other parts of the plant, just the normal trace amounts of vitamin A are made. So it's only in the part that you eat that you get extra vitamin A. So not to say who's right or who's wrong, but to say, let's weigh the benefits versus the liabilities of golden rice. If we can treat the vitamin A deficiency in hundreds of thousands or millions of people simply by feeding them genetically modified rice, does that outweigh whatever liabilities there are? And I'm not aware that there are any liabilities. Golden rice is grown just like other rice. It's eaten just like other rice. I haven't ever heard of anything that's wrong with it, although it's never been grown commercially. I just put this in to show you where in the world the diet is heavily dependent on rice. You can see that in the Western world and in Africa, not much. Most rice consumption is in India, Asia, and Southeast Asia. So where have golden rice approvals been made in 2021? US, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. And people who are advocating the growing of golden rice are predicting that it will not be approved in other countries in 2023 or later. And as I said, this organization, Greenpeace, is leading the effort to prevent golden rice from being grown. And here's a quote from one of their brochures. Greenpeace opposes the release of GE crops, including golden rice, because GE crops are prone to unexpected effects which can pose a risk to the environment and food safety. End of quote. This next is for me. My question is, what are these unexpected effects? I haven't seen in anything that I've read any evidence that there are unexpected effects in either environmental considerations or in food safety. So I would say the burden of proof is on Greenpeace to show that there's something dangerous or unwanted about golden rice. And then if such a thing were found, that would have to be weighed against its benefits. Benefits versus liabilities. This should be the consideration on a product, not the technology used to produce it. Now here is another example, decaffeinated coffee. It's been around a long time, but it's not popular because it doesn't taste good to most people. Many people would who have an adverse reaction to caffeine can't drink coffee or can't drink much of it because of the caffeine. They'd like decaf, but it doesn't taste good. So only about worldwide, 10% of the coffee consumed on a worldwide basis, only 10% is decaffeinated. Now, how do you decaffeinate? Well, either you can soak the coffee beans in water so that you leach out the caffeine, try to remove other things and return it to the beans. This works to some extent. Or organic solvents can be used, in which case the taste is usually much worse than if water is used. Well, there's a third option, genetic alteration. One thing you could do is look for natural variation in the wild, and people have done that. None has ever been found that I know of. Or you could create a caffeineless mutant in the lab. For example, CRISPR would do a good job of that. And I've shown you here the biosynthetic pathway for caffeine. Caffeine's here at the end. You can see that there are several committed steps, starting here with number 1, number 2, and number 3, and you end up with caffeine. So CRISPR could very easily be used in a coffee plant to snip out any or all of these genes. So the only change in the coffee plant would be it doesn't make caffeine if you cut out this gene. If you did this one, you'd miss both theobromine, which is a component of chocolate, and caffeine. But that would be the choice of the investigator, which gene you wanted to cut out, he or she. So why hasn't this been done? I think primarily because of the controversial nature of this technology. So it's not that there's anything wrong with the product, but some organizations and people object to the technology that would be used to make such a mutant.
I just think messing with coffee is criminal in general.
Anything with coffee is criminal?
No, I'm saying messing with coffee is criminal. It works, leave it alone. A lot of us need it. The
Yeah,
caffeine.
there's nothing there's nothing wrong with you liking coffee the way it is. If there were a mutant that didn't make caffeine, you wouldn't have to drink it. Okay, so genetic technology is controversial, and it's needless. There are many pros, which I won't go into, we're running out of time, but the thing I want to emphasize here is in pink, that I'm not aware of any case of toxicity in food. So there, as I say, are pros and cons, but the point I want to leave you with is that we should not be evaluating products based on their technology, but based on their merits. Each new product should be evaluated on its merits. Is it good or bad for whatever its purpose was intended, and not by the technology used to produce it. Again, we're contrasting two technologies here: sperm and egg on the one hand, genetic manipulation on the other. So it always asks the question, do benefits outweigh the liabilities or not? And this is a judgment that people have to make. Okay, this is a summary slide that you can, this slide set is in your Canvas container. You can look at the summary on your own time because I'm running short of time here. I want to change the topic. Can you see energy sources?
Yes.
Are you still on genetics?
No, we see energy.
Yeah.
You can see it, okay. All right, I want to spend just a little time giving you some thoughts about climate change. It's such a big issue and it's so critical to life on this planet. This is a biology course which deals with life. So I'd like to talk about the effects of energy sources on life. My take-home message is right here in the headline on this slide. Energy sources can be either combustible, which means you have to burn them, which results in carbon dioxide production, or they can be non-combustible, in which case they do not yield carbon dioxide. And my message is we have to convert to non-combustible sources of energy in order to save the planet, because as I'll show you, we're in bad shape right now. Global warming has been going on since the 1800s. And it coincides with an increase in production of carbon dioxide. And you can see here maps of the US over time. This is over the course of the 20th century, the 19th century, sorry. And the blue means temperature is cooler than the 100-year average, and red, temperature is warmer than the 100-year average. And what you can see is that as decades have gone by, temperatures in the US have gotten warmer and warmer, and finally now they are very warm, especially in the Southwest. So we can go back 800,000 years, and from there until the present time, we can look at carbon dioxide in the environment. And you can see that it's fluctuated over time, over hundreds of thousands of years. Until recently, it stopped fluctuating and it's going in one direction, straight up. So CO2 is accumulating at an alarming rate, and it is the main polluter of the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide far outweighs any of the other atmospheric pollutants. And this leads to what is called the greenhouse effect. You've probably all been in a greenhouse on a sunny day, and you know that it gets very hot. And the reason is the sunlight comes into the greenhouse and can't escape because of the glass roof. Well, the same thing happens on our planet. The sun shines, heat strikes the earth, some of it stays and some of it is reflected. What carbon dioxide does is form a shield in the upper atmosphere so that instead of being reflected effectively, the heat is trapped. And the more carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere, the thicker this shield gets and the warmer the planet gets. So this illustrates the carbon cycle and the unbalanced carbon cycle. So where does carbon dioxide come from naturally? From respiration, primarily. Plants and animals respire, produce carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide is fixed by photosynthesis. The dark reaction, you remember when we talked about that. And so in an undisturbed environment, in other words, with no human activities, this cycle is balanced. However, because of humans, we now burn fossil fuels, releasing carbon dioxide. And we do a lot of deforestation, which results in a lot of carbon dioxide, much more than photosynthesis can absorb. So what we end up with is accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that leads to the greenhouse effect, global warming. Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over this because we don't have much time left. The point is that many species are facing extinction within 30 years. The causes are many: overhunting, overfishing, destruction of natural habitats, pollution with all kinds of things, and the human population keeps growing. It's going to have a 25% increase by the year 2050, and all these people have to go somewhere. And biodiversity is necessary for many, many reasons. So it is important that biodiversity is improved. We stop losing species to global warming. There is hope. One is the Paris Climate Agreement, which you may have heard of. The objective of that is to prevent global temperatures from increasing more than 2 degrees centigrade above that set before the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which have been back in the 1700s. There's another project that is hopeful. It's called the Global Deal for Nature. The plan is called 30 by 30. It's a proposal to conserve 30% of the Earth in its natural state by the year 2030. Now, this is receiving a lot of support from governments. 50 nations have signed up, and it's getting a lot of funding from governments, corporations, and foundations. So the combination of these two things gives some hope that that the rate of extinction can be slowed down or maybe even stopped. Okay, what is the source of carbon dioxide? It's burning. Anything you burn results in the production of carbon dioxide. And I've used it as an example here, driving your car, which burns gasoline, unless you have an electric one. So the main component of gasoline is octane, an 8-carbon hydrocarbon. When you burn it, 2 molecules of octane combine with 25 molecules of oxygen to give 18 molecules of water, 16 molecules of carbon dioxide, and the energy that makes your car go. So in addition to global warming, carbon dioxide contributes to depletion of the ozone layer, acidification, and toxicity. Effects of global warming. I'm going to go through all these. Sea levels are rising. I just said extinction of many species is going on. Plant and animal behavior is changing. Human health and welfare. You know, just listening to the news, that storms are increasing in frequency and in degree. They're getting more serious. Every year, the hurricane season, especially in the south, more named storms occur than in any preceding year. Droughts, economic collapse, ecosystem, and even war occur as a result of global warming. Now, this is a sort of a mind game we can play. Imagine what would happen if all the ice on the planet melts, which it seems to be on its way to doing. The polar ice caps are melting at an accelerating pace. Well, if that happened, computer models would show that the shoreline of the US would shrink dramatically. So for example, the entire Atlantic seaboard would be underwater. the entire state of Florida and the Gulf Coast would be. On the West Coast, San Francisco would be just a cluster of islands. The Central Valley would be a bay, and the Gulf of California would extend from where it is now up to north of San Diego, north of where we are. And this is not only a projection that could happen sometime off in the distant future, it's happening right now at various places around the world. Seawater is encroaching on agricultural land. So for example, in Bangladesh, it's very difficult to grow rice because the soils are contaminated by seawater, among other places. And in the Pacific in particular, some islands have already vanished. Here's an example of an atoll that this is the way it used to look, and this is the way it looks now. It's completely underwater. And a whole sets of islands are in danger of disappearing. In fact, the presidents of several of these have appeared before the United Nations asking for something to be done to protect their islands from going out of existence, meaning that all the people, all the citizens of those islands have to leave. So where does energy come from now? From fossil fuels, which are non-renewable and combustible, from renewable fuels that are combustible, and from renewable fuels that are non-combustible. And I want to focus on this latter category because if anything is going to save the planet, it's going to be a move to this type of fuel. But right now, the fossil fuels worldwide are the majority of the energy supply. Renewable fuels are important because they're renewable, but you still have to burn them. So if you have to burn anything, it produces carbon dioxide. So for example, ethanol or biomass or wastes from various sources, all have to be burned. Renewable non-combustible fuels, on the other hand, are a very small proportion of the total energy supply, but we get those from water, from wind, from sun, geothermal, tides and waves, although they're very energetic. We haven't really harnessed them yet. And then about 5% we get worldwide from nuclear energy. So here's the essential point in red. Carbon dioxide accumulation will end only when the sources of it are eliminated. So we have to replace combustible fuels with non-combustible ones. And I'll go over this quickly. The only sources of non-combustible energy here are indicated by arrows: solar, wind, hydroelectricity, and nuclear power. Germany leads the world in non-combustible energy production, that's shown in this chart from last year. So 55% of their electricity comes from non-combustible sources, and they are nuclear, the sun, wind, water, and that's it. So that adds up to 55%. We can't include biomass in it because, as I said, it's combustible. Where does the US stand? Well, quite far behind. If we look at where we are now in 2021, 2020, non-combustible is about 38%, as combustible is about 61%. And this is again for electricity generation. And if you look at the non-combustible, here are the percentages from solar, wind, geothermal, hydroelectric, and nuclear. One segment of the economy is cars. Which country leads the way in the purchase of electric cars? It's Norway. In 2019, 55% of the new car sales were electric in Norway, whereas at the same time in the US, it was about 2%. However, the US is slowly catching up, trying to. So in 2021, so far, the percent is 3.5 compared to 2 a couple of years ago. And interestingly, you may have seen this in the news, Ford produces a pickup truck called the F-150, and it happens to be the best-selling vehicle in the entire world. It has had that position for 36 years. This week, they announced, or they released, an electric version, all electric version, dual motors on the axles, all-wheel drive. And you may have seen President Biden actually went to Detroit and drove one yesterday. So that's an indication of support from our present government for clean energy.
He took off on that thing.
Yeah, he really hit the accelerator. It was fun to watch him go. This is a map of the US showing distribution of new car sales that are electric. California leads the way by a lot. Interestingly, Hawaii also has a high purchase rate. So looking forward, what do we have to do? We have to stop governments from subsidizing fossil fuels. They subsidize a huge amount. Fossil fuel industry doesn't need it, and it's going in the wrong direction. We need to consider a tax on carbon. I'll talk about that in a bit. Carbon sequestration is another thing that needs a good look at. And we need to transition jobs from fossil fuels to clean energy. And we need better storage batteries. The ones we have now are woefully inadequate. We're doing the best we can, but we need much better battery technology. And we need a lot more solar farms and wind farms. Speaking of that, just this week, a project called Vineyard Wind was announced. This is the largest wind farm in the US to date. As I say, it was just now approved. It's off the coast of Massachusetts, just south of Martha's Vineyard, a large area here where these windmills have been installed. Here you can see a large array of them. It is intended to enter into service in 2 years, 2023. It will generate enough electricity for 400,000 homes per year. And interestingly, these windmills are just huge, 300 feet high. That's as high as a football field is long. And one turn of the blades generates enough electricity to power one home for one day. So this is a hopeful sign. We need a lot more projects like this. So here's something I want you to think about. Thermodynamics, the first law of thermodynamics, and how that relates to this energy problem. So the first law says energy is neither created nor destroyed, it only changes form. So for our purposes, we're talking about two forms: fossil fuels and renewable energy. fossil fuels are a form of energy that's already concentrated. The concentration occurred millions of years ago in photosynthesis. Carbon was fixed. And it's resulted in vast deposits of fossil fuels. So all we have to do to get energy out of fossil fuels is light a match. And it burns, it immediately gives heat and light and energy. Renewable energy, on the other hand, regardless of where it comes from, is too diffuse to do work. It's got to be concentrated. That is, its form needs to change. So whether we get it from the sun or wind or somewhere else that's non-combustible, it has to be converted to a form of energy that we can use. That's what solar panels do. It's what wind turbines do.
Professor,
Yeah,
you talked about the waves earlier, didn't you?
yes.
Isn't that like a? Isn't that they're starting to use that? I saw it like a few years ago, and it was like I
Yeah,
thought it was really
I
good, but
don't know much about that. I know that and there's a lot of energy in waves, and people have tried to harness it. And there are gadgets that people
yeah.
put out. To my knowledge, it's not a major source of energy concentration.
Yeah.
It so far can't compete with wind and sun. But you know, if those facilities to harvest the energy of waves could be made more efficient, it would be a terrific way to get energy, non-combustible. Okay, I've got a little bit of time left. This is a picture of my son, who's a professor of political science at the Australian National University. He's currently in Singapore. His professional interest is US-China relations. And it just happened that I was in Japan delivering a series of lectures, one of which had dealt with climate change. Well, he stopped by. Actually, he made a concerted effort to come by and deliver part of one of my lectures on this topic, the political implications of non-renewable energy. So he's interested in international relations. And in this case, the effect of the world's dependence on fossil fuels, the effect of that on the political climate on the planet. So he made 2 points. Dependence on fossil fuels promotes international conflict, and it promotes dictatorships. And I'll show you, now this is his evidence, not mine. I won't talk about this right now. The point here is that the industrialized countries of the world are consumers of fossil fuels, and most of them consume more than they produce. Russia and Canada are the only countries that produce more than they consume. So the world economy at the current time, and for a long time, has been based on fossil fuels. So countries with oil-based economies, the government owns the wealth. And therefore, its allegiance is to the global oil market and not to its citizens. And this fosters authoritarian regimes. Whereas countries that have diversified economies, not based on oil, the wealth is owned more broadly, the allegiance of government is to the citizens of the country, and this fosters democracies. So one of the things that Brandon showed was this graph in which the democracy index was plotted against the percent of tax revenue from oil in various different countries around the world. And this line can be drawn, it's a statistically significant line, showing that there's a correlation between dependence on oil for your country and democracy. So the countries that depend most on oil are largely from the Middle East: Libya, Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, United Arab Emirates. Here's Venezuela and Russia, and up at the top are Norway and Canada. And so you can see the trend is that the democracy index is very low for countries that depend on oil for their economy. And the democracy index increases as dependence on oil decreases. And what is the democracy index? It's a very complicated formula, but it's based on countries that have free and fair elections, freedom of the press, civil rights protections, and then a whole lot of other things. So what's the answer? One is reduce energy consumption. Well, that's not going to happen. Sign treaties to guarantee access to fossil fuels through trade. And for example, the Paris Climate Agreement is related to this. And the main point of that is to keep global warming to less than 2% relative to pre-industrial revolution temperatures. And finally, develop not just non-renewable, but non-combustible energy sources. With respect to the Paris Climate Agreement, there have been many international conferences trying to come up with a solution to global warming, starting in 1992. The last one was in Paris in 2015. And what's the status of the Paris Agreement 5 years later? Well, this policy expert, Michael Oppenheimer from Princeton University, said this: the grade for the Paris Pact, based on the prospects of meeting a 2-degree centigrade target, the grade is D or F. In other words, it's not making any difference. Great ambitions, little enforcement. So every country in the world who signed the agreement promised to keep global temperatures low by getting off fossil fuels, halting the loss of forests, overhauling food production systems, and finding ways to suck greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. Those are all very fine goals. However, each country is allowed to make its own plans on how to accomplish these goals, and failing to meet goals has no penalties. So what we end up with is this phenomenon where every country says, okay, we got all the countries in the world have agreed to do this. Let's let the other guys do it. And we'd like to keep polluting. And so if every country says the same thing, then it ends up nothing happens. Political power of non-renewable energy, and our time is up, so if you have to leave, please do. But political action committees give money. Who do they give it to? Primarily the oil and gas industry. So the gray bars are oil and gas. Renewable energy is the red bars. And if you look at organizations that lobby the federal government for money, oil and gas industry is the gray bars. There's a lot of federal lobbying. Renewable energy lobbies are at a great disadvantage. And finally, US energy subsidies. Subsidy for carbon capture is very low. Renewables, low. Corn ethanol, and this is not even a good solution, but it's heavily subsidized by the government. but nothing compared to fossil fuels. And why does the fossil fuel industry get so much money from the government? It's a mystery. Okay, this, you can look at these slides that are in your canister. This has to do with carbon capture, and this has to do with carbon tax. And this seems like a good idea, and some countries are actually using it. So what is a carbon tax? It replaces personal income tax with a carbon tax. And the carbon tax is based on the carbon footprint of each individual or group. So in real terms, we all pay income taxes based on our income. So the more you make, the more you pay. A carbon tax would be the same thing. It would replace an income tax. The more carbon you produce, the more tax you pay. And this has been tried in a number of different places with fairly good outcomes. And the places where it has been tried and seems to be working are England, Scandinavia, and Australia. They all have carbon taxes. And you can study this map on your own time. And what is a carbon footprint? Well, I looked up how you calculate it. It's very complicated. So I put a big X here. If you want to know your carbon footprint, go on the web and look up a carbon calculator. And I'm sorry I've gone over time. Are there any questions about anything I've said about either topic, GMOs or climate? If not, I won't see you on Monday. I'll see you a week from today with the project reports. And on Monday, you have a test which covers everything since the last test and will include what we talked about today. Not much, but a couple of questions. Okay, anything else before we go?
Thank you, Professor. See
Okay,
you Wednesday.
see you in a week. And I will have an office hour on Monday if anybody wants to stop in.
Thank you.
Okay, take care. Going to end the session.